The emperor is dying, not in a palace, not on sheets of Egyptian linen, not beneath the gilded ceiling of the Palatine Hill. He lies in a military tent in Sirmium, on the banks of the Danube, where the smell of frozen earth and the weight of silence have forever replaced the incense of Roman temples. It is March of the year 180 of the Common Era. Marcus Aurelius is 58 years old. His body has been failing for weeks. The generals wait outside with scrolls in hand. The kind of scene history repeats every time power changes hands. But Marcus says nothing to them about the empire. He turns toward the wall, in silence. The man who governed the greatest empire the Western world had ever known for 19 years, and who every night wrote in a private journal he never intended for anyone to read, died alone with his thoughts. This is the story of Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who fought against himself. Before we continue, I need a moment with you. If the death of a Roman emperor in a cold tent on the banks of the Danube held your attention, this channel was made for you. Stories built on real events, with the depth that history deserves, and the calm your night is asking for. Subscribe now, and turn on the bell. The like you leave is what keeps this work alive. Take a deep breath. The story continues. There is a book that should not exist. It was not written for publication, not written for posterity, for glory, for the judgment of the ages. It was written by a man for himself, personal notes, harsh reminders, reprimands, confessions, in a Greek that was not his native tongue. Across a series of notebooks that survived for reasons historians still debate with a certain unease. We call that book the Meditations. Marcus Aurelius called it ta eishouton, things to himself. Marcus was born in the year 121 of the Common Era, into a family of Hispanic aristocracy that had climbed Rome's hierarchies across generations with the patience of those who understand that real power is not won in a single day. His father died when he was 3 years old. He was raised by his paternal grandfather, a man of severe integrity who shaped him before the world had a chance to corrupt him. He was adopted by Emperor Antoninus, pious at 17, on the direct instruction of Hadrian, who recognized in the young man something he could not find in the obvious candidates for the throne. He became emperor in the year 161 of the Common Era, at the age of 40. In practice, it was an unbroken succession of crises, wars on the northern and eastern frontiers that consumed nearly 2 decades. The Antonine Plague, which swept away between 5 and 10 million lives. Internal revolts, the betrayal of a trusted general, the deaths of 8 of the 13 children he had with Faustina, and alongside all of that, every night, in the early hours before dawn, Marcus Aurelius wrote, not about the empire, about himself. The Meditations are the only document in history in which a ruler holding absolute power over millions of people calls himself, in plain terms, lazy, vain, and incapable of living by the principles he claimed to follow. There is no other document like it. But there is a detail almost no one mentions. The Meditations do not begin with philosophy. They begin with a list of people, teachers, family members, friends, and what Marcus learned from each of them. The second name on that list is his father's, the biological father who died when Marcus was 3 years old, the man from whom, by any reasonable measure of childhood memory, he could have had no real recollection. Marcus Aurelius opened his private journal by giving thanks to a man he barely knew. That says more about who he was than any battle he ever fought. And it is the first key to understanding the war he waged his entire life, not against the barbarians of the Danube. The war against himself. Today, when we talk about the transfer of power, we talk about elections, family inheritance, institutional processes with defined rules and predictable outcomes. Power passes from one person to another through mechanisms that, even when imperfect, follow a logic everyone recognizes. In the Roman Empire of the 2nd century, the mechanism was different and radically more effective. The system historians call imperial adoption, by which an emperor without a suitable son would adopt the man he considered most capable of governing, regardless of biological ties, had produced, in the 4 decades before Marcus was born, a succession of rulers of exceptional quality: Nerban, Trajan, Adrian, Antoninus, Pius, each chosen by his predecessor on the basis of merit, each having governed with a competence that Roman history rarely equaled before or after. Marcus Aurelius was the last of that line, and his selection began before he was born. Publius, alias Hadrianus, the Emperor Hadrian, was a man of exceptional intelligence and difficult temperament who had spent his reign personally touring the empire's frontiers, reforming the army, and consolidating the territorial gains of his predecessors, rather than expanding them. He was also a man obsessed with the question of succession, acutely aware that the greatest threat to the empire's stability was not an external invasion, but a poorly managed transfer of power. In the year 136, Hadrian was ill and without a clear heir. He chose Lucius Cianius Commodus, a man of aristocratic family, physically impressive and politically well-connected, as his adoptive successor. Commodus died of tuberculosis in January of 138, before Hadrian himself. Hadrian was dying and needed to start over. This time he chose differently. He chose Titus, Aurelius, Fulvus, Boionius, Arius, Antoninus, the future. Antoninus, Pius, a senator of 51 with an irreproachable reputation, steady temperament, and no military ambitions that might destabilize the empire. But he imposed one condition. Antoninus had to adopt 2 men as his successors. One was Lucius Verus, son of the Commodus, who had just died. The other was Marcus Annius Verus, the future Marcus Aurelius, who was at that time 17 years old. Marcus did not know he had been chosen by a dying emperor who had never spoken directly to him. He found out when Antoninus Pius summoned him and explained what Hadrian had decided. What he felt in that moment is not recorded with certainty. What is recorded in the opening pages of the Meditations written decades later is a gratitude toward Antoninus Pius that carries an emotional specificity, setting it apart from every other entry. Marcus does not simply thank a teacher or an adoptive father. He thanks a man who had accepted a responsibility he had not asked for and had fulfilled it with a consistency Marcus considered worthy of emulation. Marcus's childhood had been marked by a central absence. His father, Marcus Annius Verus, died when the boy was 3 years old. There is no record of Marcus having any direct memories of him. What he had were stories from his mother, Domitia Lucilla, a woman of considerable culture who had personally overseen his early education, and from his paternal grandfather, who had served as consul and whom Marcus describes in the Meditations as a model of temperament and dignity. The early loss of his father created in Marcus a particular relationship with the male figures of authority he encountered throughout his life, not one of dependence, but of careful attention to what each had to teach. Combined with an independence of judgment that allowed him to respect someone deeply without uncritically adopting their positions. This pattern is visible in his relationship with the tutors Antoninus Pius assigned him after the adoption. The most celebrated was Marcus Cornelius Fronto, the greatest Latin rhetorician of his era. A man whose correspondence with Marcus has partially survived and reveals a relationship of genuine affection between teacher and student. Fronto taught rhetoric, the art of speaking and writing persuasively, and considered philosophy a dangerous distraction for a future ruler. An emperor needed to communicate with clarity and authority, not contemplate the nature of the good. Marcus learned rhetoric from Fronto, and then left it behind in favor of philosophy. Philosophy came through Apollonius of Chalcedon, a Stoic whom Marcus describes in the Meditations as the man who taught him to be free despite external circumstances. A description that carries particular weight when one considers that Marcus's external circumstances included being heir to the greatest empire in the world. The Stoicism Marcus learned from Apollonius, and later deepened on his own, was not the austere, detached philosophy that modern caricature suggests, the impassive sage who feels nothing. It was a philosophy of active engagement with the world, combined with rigorous internal discipline. Do what is right because it is right, regardless of the outcome. Accept what cannot be changed without spending energy resisting the inevitable. Treat every human being with the consideration owed to a rational being. For a man who would be emperor, these ideas were not abstract, they were a program of governance, and Marcus spent decades trying to apply them, with results that were simultaneously more and less than philosophy promised. There is a paradox at the center of Marcus Aurelius's formation that his biographers rarely examine with the attention it deserves. The imperial adoption system that had chosen him was the most meritocratic the ancient world had produced. It identified the best available candidate, gave him decades of supervised preparation, and transferred power in an orderly fashion when the moment came. It was, on its own terms, extraordinarily effective. But it carried a human cost the system never calculated. The cost of knowing, from the age of 17, that you would be emperor, and not knowing when. Marcus Aurelius spent 23 years as the designated heir of Antoninus Pius. 23 years of training, observation, and careful preparation for a responsibility that would arrive at an indeterminate moment. 23 years of being the second most important man in Rome without holding any real power over anything of consequence. Antoninus Pius governed until the age of 74 with a health that defied all expectations. Marcus waited. What he did during that waiting period is, paradoxically, the most important aspect of his formation, more than the adoption, more than the tutors, more than the years of formal study. Because it was during those 23 years that Marcus developed, out of both necessity and choice, the set of internal practices that would become the foundation of the Meditations and the backbone of his reign. The central practice was writing. Not public writing, the speeches, official letters, and state documents that any political figure produced. Private writing, the notebooks, where he recorded observations about his own behavior, identified patterns he wanted to change, and applied the Stoic principles he had learned from Apollonius to the concrete problems of his daily life. The notebooks that survived as the Meditations are probably a later and more refined version of that practice, written during the military campaigns of his final years. But the practice itself began during the years of waiting, and there are elements in the Meditations that seem to refer to the experiences of a young man. not of an emperor on campaign. His marriage to Faustina the Younger in 145 AD was another axis of those years. Faustina was the daughter of Antoninus Pius, which made the marriage simultaneously a family alliance and a consolidation of Marcus's position in the line of succession. But the Meditations suggest something that transcended the political. Marcus writes about Faustina with a specificity of detail, her affection, her simplicity, her temperament, that appears nowhere else in the book, except in his references to his philosophical tutors. It was a relationship of genuine feeling. They had 14 children. Only 6 survived childhood. Infant mortality in 2nd century Rome was a brutal reality that touched every family, including the imperial one. Marcus buried 8 children. The Meditations do not speak of this directly. The grief is present in the absence, in the way the text approaches death, with an urgency that is not merely philosophical. There is one entry where Marcus writes that he must be indifferent to the loss of children. It is the least convincing entry in the entire book. The years of waiting were also the years in which Marcus completed his philosophical education on his own terms. Beyond Apollonius, he studied with Quintus Junius Rusticus, a Stoic who introduced him to the writings of Epictetus, a formerly enslaved man of the previous century whose discourses became for Marcus the central philosophical reference. Epictetus had written about inner freedom as the only real freedom, the capacity to choose how to respond to what happens, regardless of what happens. It was a philosophy developed by a man who had been enslaved and who therefore knew the absence of external freedom, in the most direct and personal way possible. Marcus read those texts as heir to the Roman Empire. The irony was not lost on him. There is an entry in the Meditations where he writes that a man can be enslaved inside a palace just as surely as he can be free inside a prison, that external conditions are irrelevant to internal ones. It is an idea inherited directly from Epictetus. But in Marcus's hands, a man who lived in a palace and who would soon be responsible for the freedom and bondage of millions, the idea takes on a dimension the original never had. Antoninus Pius fell ill in the spring of 161 AD. In his final moments, he called for the guards and gave them the evening password that the emperor passed to the commander of the Praetorian Guard. The password was, according to the sources, equanimetas, equanimity. Then he passed the golden statue of Fortuna, which always accompanied the emperor, into Marcus's chamber, and died. Marcus Aurelius was 40 years old. He had waited 23 years for this moment. And the first thing he did was refuse to rule alone. Imagine walking into the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill in Rome in the year 161 AD. The first thing you feel is the weight of the silence. Not the silence of an empty place. The palace is full of officials, guards, secretaries, ambassadors, waiting for an audience in the outer corridors. It is the silence of a place where everyone speaks in low voices, where every word is measured before it is spoken, where the sound of footsteps on cold marble echoes in a way that constantly reminds you that you are somewhere. Decisions carry real weight over real lives. The smell is of candle wax and papyrus, documents everywhere. Piles and piles of documents. Because governing 70 million people across 5 million square miles of territory generates a volume of paperwork that never stops growing. At the center of all of it, Marcus Aurelius. He is 40 years old. He has just become emperor, and the first thing he did was call for Lucius Verus. Lucius Verus was Marcus's adoptive brother, The other man, Hadrian, had required Antoninus Pius to adopt as a condition of his own adoption. He was 30 years old, physically impressive, fond of hunting, gladiators, and parties, and had spent the past 23 years in Marcus's shadow with a graciousness that suggested either he had genuinely accepted his secondary role or was intelligent enough to pretend that he had. Marcus insisted on sharing power with him. There was no clear precedent for this in Roman imperial history. There had been coemperors in specific contexts, father and son, transitional periods, but an emperor in full exercise of power voluntarily dividing authority with another man of equal standing was something new. The Senate was baffled. The generals were uneasy. Rome's tradition of unified command was one of the reasons the army functioned with the efficiency it had. Marcus stated his position with a brevity the sources record. The state was too large for one man. 2 emperors meant a crisis in the east could be managed, while a crisis in the north was simultaneously addressed. It was a pragmatic argument that concealed a deeper philosophical conviction that power should not be accumulated beyond what is necessary, that the temptation of absolute authority was precisely the kind of thing the Meditations identified as corrosive to character. The early years of the reign were marked by a series of reforms that revealed the new emperor's character with a clarity no public declaration could match. Marcus reformed the judicial system with particular attention to protecting the most vulnerable enslaved people, women, children, the poor. He restricted the conditions under which an enslaved person could be executed by their owner. He reformed guardianship laws to protect orphans from guardians who used the position for personal gain. He expounded the right to appeal in criminal proceedings. These reforms were not popular among the senatorial aristocracy, who saw them as weakening the hierarchies that sustained Roman order. Marcus approved them anyway. There is an entry in the Meditations from this period where he writes that a ruler's first duty is to act for the good of those governed, not for the applause of the powerful. That the approval of those who hold power is often the most reliable sign that one is making the wrong decision. It was a position that carried political costs. Marcus paid them without hesitation. Then, in 162 AD, came the news that changed everything. The Parthian king, Vologases IV, had taken advantage of the transition of power in Rome to invade Armenia, a buffer state the Romans considered within their sphere of influence, and had defeated a Roman army commanded by the governor of Syria. It was a military humiliation and a direct test of the new administration. Marcus made a decision that surprised the generals. He sent Lucius Verus. He did not go himself. He stayed in Rome managing the civil administration while his adoptive brother commanded the largest Roman military operation in decades. The decision had pragmatic logic. Someone had to remain in Rome, but it also had a personal dimension the Meditations illuminate obliquely. Marcus wrote, in an entry of uncertain date, but possibly from this period, that a leader must know his limits as well as his capabilities. That sending the right man to the right task is a form of wisdom that pride frequently prevents. Lucius Verus departed for the east in 162 AD. He returned in 166 AD with a complete military victory, and with something more that no one had asked for or anticipated. The Plague. Chapter 4. I saw cities where the living could no longer tend to the dead. I saw physicians who departed before their patients. I saw temples filled with people praying to gods who did not answer. And I saw what a nameless disease does to an empire when it enters through the borders carried by the very armies that had just won there. is no record that Marcus Aurelius wrote exactly those words. But there are records of what happened between 166 AD and the end of his reign. And what happened is documented thoroughly enough that these words, if not literally his, are at least true to what he lived through. The army of Lucius Verus returned from the east in the autumn of 166 AD, carrying a disease that physicians of the era could neither identify nor treat. The symptoms the sources describe, high fever, skin eruptions, severe weakness, and progressive deterioration, correspond with enough precision to what we today recognize as smallpox for most modern historians to identify it as such. The disease spread through the army, from the army to the camps, from the camps to the frontier cities, from the frontier cities into the interior of the empire through the Roman roads. The same infrastructure that made Rome the most efficient political system the ancient world had produced also made it the fastest disease-spreading network that had ever existed. In 166 AD, the illness reached Rome. The physician Galen, the most important of his time, whose work would influence Western medicine for 1400 years, was in Rome when the epidemic arrived and left detailed clinical descriptions of the symptoms he observed. He then departed for his hometown of Pergamon, citing a family emergency. Modern historians have read that departure as flight, the greatest physician in the world, abandoning the capital of the empire at the moment he was most needed. Galen returned when summoned by Marcus. But he did not stay on the front lines of the epidemic. Marcus stayed. The meditations from this period carry a tone that shifts in a detectable way from the earlier entries. Death, always a present theme, treated with the stoic serenity of one who accepts it as inevitable, becomes more urgent, more concrete, more personal. There are entries where Marcus writes about the brevity of life with a specificity that is not philosophical but visceral, like someone who watches people slip away in numbers that make abstraction impossible. One of the most widely quoted entries in the Meditations comes from this period. Marcus writes that he must consider all that exists as fleeting and already gone empires, emperors, cities, the names men believe to be immortal. That Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, is as transient as the steam rising from a pot on the fire and vanishing within seconds. This is not the writing of a man at peace with death. It is the writing of a man who practices accepting death every day because every day death is present in a way that allows no ignorance and no distance. The epidemic reduced the empire's population by somewhere between 7 and 15% over 14 years. In some of the more densely inhabited regions, local losses ran even deeper. The army lost a sufficient proportion of its soldiers that Marcus had to recruit gladiators and freed enslaved men to fill the ranks, an unprecedented measure that the sources describe as profoundly unsettling to the traditional standards of Roman recruitment. Marcus responded to the crisis with an administrative competence historians recognize as exceptional given the circumstances. He organized food distribution in the most affected regions. He funded public farewell ceremonies when families lacked the means. He reorganized military recruitment to compensate for the losses. He kept the administration of justice functioning when the temptation to suspend the court for practical reasons was considerable. And he kept writing. The Meditations do not pause during the epidemic. If anything, they grow denser, more entries, shorter ones, as though the time available for writing was growing ever scarcer, while the need to write was growing ever more urgent. In 169 AD, Lucius Verus died. The sources disagree on the cause. Some say sudden collapse, others suggest the epidemic itself. What is documented is that he died during a journey, with no prior signs of chronic illness to explain the death. Marcus was left to govern alone for the first time. He was 48 years old. He had shared power for 8 years with a man who, whatever his personal limitations, had been a constant presence and a point of political balance. The solitude of absolute power he had always feared had arrived, and in the weeks that followed, the wars of the North intensified in a way that left no time to contemplate that solitude. In 166 AD, while the epidemic was entering Rome through the southern gates, a coalition of Germanic tribes was crossing the Danube through the northern ones. This was not a raiding party, the kind of quick strike that border tribes launched regularly, and that the Roman army repelled with routine efficiency. It was an armed migration on a scale the Roman frontiers had not faced in generations. The Marcomanni and the Quadi, pressured by population movements even further to the east that modern historians associate with the beginning of the Great Migration, crossed the Danube in force and advanced into Roman territory with a determination suggesting no intention to withdraw. In 167 AD, for the first time since the Punic Wars, 300 years earlier, an enemy army entered Italy. Rome panicked. Marcus did not. What the sources describe of Marcus's behavior during the weeks following the Germanic advance into Italy reveals the character. The Meditations document in the abstract the capacity to separate the emotional response from the functional one, to do what the situation demanded without spending energy on the terror the situation warranted. He convened the Senate. He laid out the situation with precision. He listed the available resources and those that still needed to be created. And then he made a decision no Roman emperor had made in the previous 2 centuries. He went to the front lines himself. Marcus Aurelius was 46 years old, had never commanded an army in combat, and suffered from chronic chest pain that physicians treated with theriac, a complex medicinal compound that doctors of the era prescribed for chronic pain. He was not a warrior. He was an administrator, a philosopher, a judge, a man whose capabilities were all internal, all cerebral, all oriented toward solving problems through language and thought. And he went to war anyway. The base camp for Roman operations in the Marcomannic Wars was established at Carnuntum, in what is now modern-day Austria, on the southern bank of the Danube. It was a permanent camp with stone structures, not the campaign tents of a temporary expedition, which revealed an expectation that the wars would last years, not months. It was at Carnuntum that Marcus wrote most of the Meditations that have survived. The conditions were radically different from those on the Palatine Hill. The cold of the Danubian winter was unlike the cold of Rome, more damp, more penetrating, with snowstorms that made military operations impossible for months and confined the emperor to the interior of the camp with his notebooks and his thoughts. The smell of the camp horses, wet leather, burning wood, the persistent odor of men who lived far from the comforts of the city, was the opposite of the perfumed atmosphere of the imperial palace. The Meditations written at Carnuntum have a different texture from the earlier ones, shorter, more direct, as though the physical nearness of death. The camp regularly received reports of losses, and the epidemic continued to gradually weaken the army, had compressed Marcus's thinking into a more essential form, stripping away the elaboration the palatial environment had allowed. One of the best-known entries comes from this period. You lose what you don't hold on to. But you cannot hold on to what was never yours. It is a sentence about loss, written by a man who sent soldiers into the field every day. The wars of the North were not only a military problem, they were a philosophical problem of the most concrete kind. How a man who believed violence was the last justifiable resort could spend years ordering conflict on a scale his philosophy had never anticipated. Marcus resolved this problem, or tried to, with a distinction the Meditations elaborate carefully. The difference between war as an instrument of aggression and war as an instrument of protection. The Romans had not started the Marcomannic Wars. The tribes had crossed the border. The military response was, in his logic, an act of protection for the citizens he had sworn to defend. It was a distinction that let him sleep at night. Or at least it was what he wrote. The period between 168 and 175 AD was one of intermittent campaigns with variable results. The Roman army, still weakened by the epidemic and by the recruitment of gladiators and freedmen, did not have the efficiency of the legions of Trajan's era. Marcus compensated for the military degradation with active diplomacy, bribing tribes to remain neutral, negotiating separate agreements with groups that could be separated from the enemy coalition, using money and territorial concessions as instruments just as much as the legions themselves. It was a way of waging war that more traditional generals found dishonorable. Marcus found it effective. By 175 AD, the situation in the north had stabilized enough for Marcus to plan a final campaign that would establish the frontier definitively, possibly incorporating Germanic territories into the empire, which would have radically altered the course of European history. And then came the news of Avidius Cassius. There is a paradox at the heart of Marcus Aurelius's marriage. The man who wrote more honestly than any other ruler of antiquity about his own faults, weaknesses, and contradictions, the man who called himself lazy, vain, and incapable of living by his own principles, never wrote a single negative word about his wife. Not one. This would be irrelevant if Faustina were a minor figure. But Faustina, the younger daughter of Antoninus, pious, Empress of Rome for nearly 20 years, mother of 14 children of whom only 6 survived childhood, was one of the most talked about and most attacked women of her era. Hostile sources accused her of systematic infidelity, of taking lovers among gladiators and sailors, of conspiring with Avidius Cassius before the rebellion of 175 AD, of having been the one to encourage him to declare himself emperor, perhaps in anticipation that Marcus would die on campaign and that she would need a new husband with sufficient military power to protect her children. These accusations circulated widely during Faustina's lifetime and continued to circulate after her death. Marcus never publicly addressed them. And in the Meditations, the only place where the emperor spoke honestly about everything he wrote about Faustina, with a gratitude and affection carrying an emotional specificity that sets those entries apart from any other in the book. He thanks her for her gentleness, her warmth, her simplicity. He thanks her for their children. There is no irony in these entries. There is none of the careful distance Marcus maintains when writing about figures he respects but holds reservations about. There is a closeness suggesting that the man who wrote about Faustina in the Meditations knew a person radically different from the one the hostile sources described. The historical question is, who was right? The honest answer is that all the sources hostile to Faustina are, without exception, also hostile to Marcus, written by authors with a political interest in discrediting the Antonine regime, or who wrote decades after the fact with access to rumors that had grown and distorted over time. Te Storia Augusta. The primary source of the accusations against Faustina is a text of such uneven reliability that modern historians treat it with a suspicion bordering on systematic distrust. The marriage had been arranged by Antoninus Pius in 145 AD, when Marcus was 24 and Faustina was approximately 15. It was a political marriage, the adoptive emperor's daughter with the designated heir, consolidating the line of succession with an additional family bond. There was no reason for it to be more than that, but the Meditations suggest it was. There is a specific quality in the way Marcus writes about Faustina that appears in no other relationship he describes: an absence of reserve, a simplicity of feeling that contrasts with the careful elaboration characterizing his references to tutors, generals, and colleagues. With everyone else, Marcus gives thanks for what he learned. With Faustina, he gives thanks for what he received. A subtle but real distinction between intellectual gratitude and emotional gratitude. They had 14 children between 147 and 169 AD. 8 died in infancy or early youth. The names of those who died are recorded in the sources with a consistency suggesting that Marcus and Faustina acknowledged them publicly. They did not erase them from the family history, as was the tendency when a child's death was considered politically inconvenient. Infant mortality in 2nd century Rome was a reality that touched every family. Knowing that does not make it easier to imagine burying 8 children. The Meditations do not speak of the children's deaths directly, but there are entries about loss, about the need to accept that what we love does not belong to us, that our attachments are loans that nature eventually reclaims, carrying an urgency that abstract Stoic philosophy does not fully explain. Someone who had lost 8 children wrote those entries. Faustina died in 175 AD during the military campaign that had been interrupted by the rebellion of Cassius. She died in a city in Anatolia called Halala during a journey on which she was accompanying Marcus to the east. The cause is unknown. The sources say gout, which is clinically unlikely for a woman in her mid-40s, and is probably a simplification of something more complex. Marcus was devastated in a way he could not entirely conceal. He asked the Senate to deify Faustina, a request that was granted, making her diva, divine, officially incorporated into the imperial pantheon. He renamed the city where she died Faustinopolis. He created an institution to support poor girls in her memory, the Puleal Faustiniani, funded with imperial resources. And in the Meditations, after November of 175 AD, Faustina's name never appears again. Not once. The silence of a man who wrote about everything is sometimes the most eloquent document he leaves behind. In April of 175 AD, while Marcus was in the north, planning the final campaign that would bring the Marcomannic Wars to a decisive close, a message arrived from the east. Avidius Cassius, the most capable general in the Roman army, the man to whom Marcus had entrusted command of all the eastern provinces, the man who had been loyal for 15 years, had declared Marcus dead and proclaimed himself emperor. It was a lie. Marcus was alive, but Cassius had the support of 3 provinces and armies enough to make the lie dangerous. The rebellion lasted 3 months and 26 days. Cassius was killed by his own soldiers before Marcus could reach the east. Marcus pardoned Cassius's entire family. He burned the letters proving who had conspired with him without reading them. In the Meditations, there is not a single reference to Avidius Cassius. The rebellion of Avidius Cassius was the most personal crisis of Marcus Aurelius's reign, not the most dangerous militarily, The Marcomannic Wars had been longer and costlier in lives and resources. Not the most demographically devastating, the plague had claimed millions, while the rebellion lasted only months, but the most personal, because it involved a betrayal by someone in whom Marcus had placed a trust that went beyond the professional. Avidius Cassius was of Syrian origin, the son of a grammarian who had risen to the equestrian order, and had built a military career that made him, in the estimation of most Roman generals of the era, the most talented field commander in the imperial army. Marcus had entrusted him with supreme command of the East, Syria, Egypt, the entire region, with an autonomy no other general possessed. It was a trust reflecting not only Cassius's competence, but Marcus's conviction that between them there existed an understanding that transcended the normal hierarchical relationship between emperor and general. When news of Cassius's proclamation arrived, Marcus was planning the final campaign in the north. The sources describe his reaction with a consistency suggesting it is genuine, not the explosive rage the betrayal would have justified, not the panic the military threat would have demanded, but a deep and controlled grief that those present recognized as different from the emperor's usual philosophical serenity. It was the sorrow of someone betrayed by a person he cared for. Marcus wrote to the Senate requesting clemency for Cassius and his supporters before learning that Cassius had been killed. That letter survived in a probably edited form in the Historia Augusta and is one of the most revealing documents of Marcus's character precisely because it was written under pressure, not in philosophical hindsight. It argues that an emperor who punishes betrayal with widespread execution is an emperor who has confirmed that the betrayal was worth the risk, that the traitors correctly calculated that the power at stake justified the gamble, that the only way to make betrayal truly unrewarding is to meet it with a clemency that renders it pointless. It was a sophisticated political argument. It was also, in all likelihood, the way Marcus rationalized a genuine incapacity to punish people with the brutality the position demanded. The two things are not mutually exclusive. When he arrived in the east and found the rebellion already crushed by Cassius's own soldiers, Marcus faced the question of the letters. There were letters, many letters, documenting who in Rome and in the provinces had supported Cassius, who had pledged loyalty to the usurper, who had wagered on Marcus's death. Those letters constituted evidence of treason sufficient to justify trials, convictions, and a considerable number of executions. Marcus had the letters brought to him, and burned them without reading them. The decision was deliberate and public, not a private gesture but a calculated political act designed to be seen and interpreted. By burning the letters unread, Marcus eliminated the possibility of acting on their contents, not because he did not want to know who the traitors were, but because he knew that if he did know, he would be pressured to punish them, and that the punishment would generate resentments lasting decades. Forced silence was more valuable than justice. This decision stands in tension with the Stoic principles Marcus professed. Stoicism values truth above convenience, knowledge above comfortable ignorance. Burning the letters unread was a deliberate choice not to know, which is a form of intellectual dishonesty that the Marcus of the Meditations would have criticized in anyone else. But the Marcus of the Meditations wrote in the abstract. The Emperor Marcus governed in the concrete. And the silence of the Meditations regarding Cassius, the complete absence of any reference to one of the reign's most significant crises in a journal that recorded thoughts about flies, cold food, and tedious officials, suggests there was a wound here that philosophy could not heal. Some things are too painful to write down, even in a private journal. Marcus's forgiveness was not weakness. It was the most costly and most difficult form of strength the position required, the strength not to do what anger and humiliation demanded, to act in accordance with principles when those principles cost more than violating them would have. But the silence in the Meditations suggests the cost was real, and that Marcus paid it in full. Chapter 8. Today, when an exceptional leader chooses an inadequate successor, we say that ego defeated judgment, that self-love or paternal love clouded the capacity to see clearly, that the same mind that was brilliant in everything else failed precisely at the decision that mattered most. It is a comfortable explanation. In the case of Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, it is probably incomplete. Lucius Aurelius Commodus was born in 161 AD, the same year Marcus became emperor, and was, from the beginning, the son who survived when the others died. He had a twin brother, Titus, who died at 4 years old. He had older and younger siblings who died in childhood. Commodus survived everything: the plague, childhood illnesses, the Danubian climate of the military camps where he spent part of his childhood alongside his father. That survival carried, for Marcus, a weight that transcended the biological. The Meditations contain no direct references to Commodus. As with Faustina, as with Cassius, the most emotionally charged subjects are absent from the text, which is itself a form of evidence about how heavily they weighed. But there are entries about the relationship between parents and children, about the temptation to want for our children what we want for ourselves, about the need to separate paternal love from rational judgment, that carry an urgency abstract philosophy does not fully explain. Someone who had a difficult son wrote those entries. Commodus showed concerning signs early on, not in intelligence. The sources describe him as capable when he chose to be, eloquent when he needed to be, gifted with a physical presence that impressed. The problem was character, a casual cruelty that manifested in small episodes his tutors noted with concern, an indifference to administration and philosophy that contrasted radically with the formation Marcus had considered essential for a ruler, an obsessive interest in gladiators and the Colosseum that, in the sons of aristocratic families, was seen as a tolerable pastime, but in the heir to the empire carried implications that went beyond personal taste. Marcus knew all of this. There is indirect evidence he had tried to intervene, that he had chosen tutors specifically to counterbalance the tendencies he observed in his son, that he had brought Commodus to the northern military campaigns precisely to expose him to a reality the Colosseum could not provide, that he had discussed his concerns about his heir's character with close advisers, and he named Commodus anyway. In 177 AD, Marcus conferred on Commodus the title of Augustus, co-emperor, making the succession officially irreversible. Commodus was 16 years old. Why? The simplest explanation is paternal love, that Marcus, like any father, could not see his son with the same clarity with which he saw everyone else. That emotional closeness created a selective blindness the philosopher in him would have recognized and criticized in another. But there are other explanations historians have offered based on the available documents. The first is political. The army wanted a clear biological line of succession. The soldiers who had fought under Marcus in the Marcomannic Wars were loyal to him personally, not to the abstract imperial institution. An adoptive succession, choosing the best available man as his predecessors had done, would have required that man to build his own military loyalty from scratch, at a moment when the northern frontier was still unstable. Commodus was Marcus's son. The loyalty transferred automatically. The second explanation is darker and less often discussed. Marcus was dying. Not in 177 AD, he still had 3 years to live. But the chronic illness that had followed him since the camp years was progressing. The chest pain was more frequent. The theriac he took to manage it had side effects the sources describe obliquely, but which modern historians identify as consistent with prolonged dependence on the compound. A man who knows he is going to die soon and who does not have an already prepared and ready adoptive successor may calculate that a guaranteed inadequate son is preferable to a civil war over the succession. Marcus may have chosen Commodus, not despite knowing he was unsuitable, but precisely because he knew, calculating that an orderly succession, even with the wrong candidate, was better than the chaos of a disputed one. If that was the calculation, it was wrong. Commodus became one of the worst emperors in Roman history. He turned the Colosseum into a stage for his gladiatorial fantasies. Fighting personally in staged bouts, he declared genuine victories. He persecuted the Senate with an arbitrariness that destroyed decades of carefully cultivated institutional relationships. He renamed Rome Colonia Comidiana, the colony of Commodus, and demanded to be venerated as the reincarnation of Hercules. He was assassinated in 192 AD by a conspiracy that included his own mistress. The reign of Marcus Aurelius had ended with the image of a philosopher-emperor dying in peace in a military camp, turned toward the wall in genuine equanimity. The reign of Commodus ended with a body in the bath. The distance between those two endings is the measure of Marcus's mistake. Imagine you are at Carnuntum in the winter of 178 AD. The smell reaches you first, burning wood, wet leather, the sharp odor of animals in an enclosed space, and beneath all of it, persistent and impossible to ignore, the smell of an army that has been living and dying within a few miles of this spot for more than a decade. It is the smell of a war that will not end. The Danube is frozen. The northern bank, where the Marcomanni and the Quadi have regrouped following the agreements of 175 AD, is quiet, the silence of an enemy waiting, not of an enemy defeated. The fires of the barbarian camps are visible at night from the Roman bank, points of light in the dark that the sentries count and report with a regularity confirming what everyone already knows. The war is not over. Marcus Aurelius sits in a heated room at the command headquarters. He is 57 years old. The hair you see in the marble busts in museums, thick, curled. The carefully kept beard that was the mark of philosopher-emperors, since Hadrian is now grey and thinner. The hands holding the pen show the swollen knuckles that accompany the chronic joint pain the theriac no longer fully controls. Before him lie 2 documents. One is a military report on the movements of the tribes along the northern bank. The other is a notebook open to a blank page. He picks up the pen and begins to write. Not the report, the notebook. Marcus had returned north in 178 AD with Commodus at his side, a decision combining military necessity with pedagogical urgency. The northern frontier had stabilized following the agreements of 175 AD, but the stability was fragile, dependent on arrangements with individual tribes that could be renegotiated the moment Roman pressure eased. Marcus had planned a definitive campaign that would incorporate the Germanic territories south of the Elbe as new Roman provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, which would have established a more defensible frontier and potentially altered the entire trajectory of European history. Bringing Commodus was preparation for that responsibility. His son needed to see how a large-scale military campaign was managed, how one negotiated with tribal chiefs, how an army's cohesion was maintained through a winter of limited operations. What Commodus learned during those years is difficult to assess from the available sources. What is clear is that he did not learn what Marcus had hoped. The meditations from this final period carry a quality scholars identify as different from everything that came before. Not in philosophy, the Stoic principles are the same ones running through the entire book, but in tone. In the last entries there is a serenity that is not the combative serenity of the earlier ones, the visible effort of a man forcing himself to accept what he resists accepting. It is a serenity that arrived after the struggle, not in spite of it. Marcus had been fighting himself for decades, and at some point during these final years in the north, he had stopped fighting. Not because he had given up, because he had arrived at a place where acceptance was no longer an effort but a condition, where the nearness of death was not a thought that had to be worked through philosophically, but a reality that was simply present, like the cold of the Danubian winter or the smell of the camp. There is an entry in the Meditations that historians attribute to this final period, not with documentary certainty, but based on tone and internal references. Do not waste what remains of life on thoughts about other people. Look inward. Do what nature requires. Do it now. There is no other moment. It is the sentence of someone who knows time is short. The illness that had been chronic for years became acute in the early months of 180 AD. The sources describe a rapid progression, fever, refusal to eat, a visible wasting that the camp physicians could not stop. Marcus kept working as long as he could, receiving reports, making decisions, keeping the imperial administration running from his bed when he could no longer sit at a table. He called for Commodus. He gave him his final instructions regarding the campaign. Do not abandon it. Complete what had been planned. Commodus listened, agreed, and abandoned the campaign 3 months after his father's death to return to Rome. Marcus died at Sirmium on the 17th of March, 180 AD. The last words the sources record were spoken to the officer who had kept watch at his door through the night. Go to the rising sun. I am already setting. And he turned toward the wall. The notebook was on the table. The last entry had been written the day before. Historians debate which one it was. The Meditations carry no dates that would allow us to identify it with certainty. But the book ends in the middle of a thought, as though Marcus had stopped writing to do something else, and never came back. Marcus Aurelius died in March of 180 AD, and the world he had built began to come apart within weeks. Commodus abandoned the northern campaign 3 months after his father's death, exactly what Marcus had asked him not to do. He negotiated hasty agreements with the tribes that had been on the verge of incorporation into the empire, paid considerable sums to secure a withdrawal without conflict, and set out for Rome with the speed of someone who had waited far too long for something that was finally his. In Rome, what followed over the 12 years of Commodus's reign was a systematic dismantling of everything Marcus had built with care over 19 years. The judicial reforms were reversed or ignored. The relationship with the Senate, which Marcus had cultivated with a patience the senators recognized and valued, deteriorated rapidly into a sequence of confrontations, suspicions, and arbitrary executions that destroyed the institutional trust that had taken decades to build. The provincial administration, which Marcus had managed with an attention to detail his officials described as exhausting for everyone involved, came to be managed by imperial favorites whose qualifications were personal loyalty to Commodus, not administrative competence. And then there was the Colosseum. Commodus began fighting personally as a gladiator, not in real bouts where genuine risk existed, but in staged spectacles where opponents were instructed to lose and animals were selected for their inability to pose any real threat. He declared these staged victories proof of his heroic nature. He demanded that official records describe him as the reincarnation of Hercules. He renamed Rome Colonia Commedia. The Senate, which had learned from Caligula and Nero that imperial madness had practical limits, conspired. Commodus was assassinated on the night of the 31st of December, 192 AD. His mistress, Marcia, poisoned the wine. When the poison did not act quickly enough, Commodus vomited before absorbing the full dose. An athlete named Narcissus was sent to the chamber and strangled him in the bath. He was 31 years old. What followed was the year of the 5 emperors, 193 AD, in which 5 different men claimed the imperial title in less than 12 months, 3 of whom were killed. It was the beginning of the period of instability historians identify as the end of the golden age of the Roman Empire and the start of the long process that would culminate, 3 centuries later, in the collapse of the Western Empire. The direct line between Marcus's decision to name Commodus and the decline of Rome is too long and contains too many variables to be traced with certainty. Empires do not collapse because of a single decision, but Commodus's decision to abandon the northern campaign left the Danubian frontier in a state of structural vulnerability his successors never fully resolved, and it was the pressures along that same frontier that, in the centuries that followed, became progressively unsustainable. Marcus knew that empires were transitory. He wrote about it in the Meditations with a clarity leaving no doubt about what he believed. That Alexander the Great and his coachman ended up in the same place. That the empires of Augustus and Trajan had vanished like the smoke of a snuffed candle. That his own name would be forgotten. He was wrong about that. The name was forgotten for centuries. The Middle Ages knew Marcus Aurelius more as a vague reference than as a studied figure. But the notebooks survived. They were copied in Constantinople in the 10th century by a scribe who realized that the text in his hands was unlike anything he had ever copied before. They reached the European Renaissance, were printed for the first time in 1558, and have never stopped being printed since. Frederick the Great of Prussia slept with a copy under his pillow. John Adams read it during the American Revolution and wrote that it contained more practical wisdom about governance than any other text he knew. When Jiabao, Prime Minister of China between 2003 and 2013, said in interviews that he had read the Meditations more than 100 times, a private journal written in a military camp on the Danube frontier nearly 1900 years ago, read 100 times by the leader of 1.4 billion people. Marcus had written for himself. He ended up writing for everyone. There is a temptation, when reaching the end of a life like that of Marcus Aurelius, to sum it up in a single sentence that captures everything: the philosopher-emperor, the last of the good emperors, the man who governed with wisdom in an impossible age. I will resist that temptation. Not because Marcus doesn't deserve a verdict. He does, like any historical figure of this magnitude. But because any sentence that tries to summarize Marcus Aurelius will inevitably overlook the contradiction at the center of his life. The very thing that paradoxically makes it most relevant to anyone trying to live with integrity. Marcus Aurelius was a man who knew exactly what was right, and who frequently could not do it. Who knew that power corrupts, and who exercised power for 19 years with a consistency suggesting he resisted that corruption better than almost any other ruler in history. But but who also named Commodus, burned letters without reading them, and took his medicinal compound every morning just to be able to function, who wrote in the Meditations about the need to treat every human being with equal consideration, and who presided over persecutions of Christians that modern historians debate whether he actively approved or simply failed to stop, who believed that death was natural and should be accepted without resistance, and who buried 8 children and a wife and kept governing because there was no alternative. The Meditations are not a book about how to achieve perfection. They are a book about how to live with imperfection without using it as an excuse to stop trying. This is the distinction that modern readers who come to the Meditations through self-help books frequently miss: the idea that Stoicism is a system that, properly applied, produces serenity and success. Marcus Aurelius is the most eloquent proof that it is not. The Stoicism Marcus practiced did not produce serenity, it produced the capacity to function despite the absence of serenity. It did not produce success, it produced the capacity to continue after failure. There is an entry in the Meditations that captures this with a precision no paraphrase improves. The obstacle to action advances the action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Marcus wrote that sentence somewhere amid the years of northern campaigns, plague, betrayal, and loss. Not as inspiration, as an instruction to himself. A reminder that obstacles were not interruptions to the work, but the work itself. It is the sentence of someone who had learned this, not from philosophy, but from the direct experience of watching everything he had planned be systematically interrupted by realities he had not asked for and could not control. What sets Marcus apart from other rulers who suffered as much or more is not wisdom. There are records of equally intelligent rulers who left nothing comparable. It is the habit of sitting down, opening the notebook, writing honestly about what he had done wrong, identifying where he had fallen short, and trying again the next day, every night, or in the early hours before dawn. For decades, in a military camp carrying the smell of war, in a palace carrying the smell of incense, with joint pain the compound no longer fully controlled, with the noise of the children who were still alive and the silence of those who were not, the habit never stopped. And it is that habit, not the battles, not the reforms, not the abstract philosophy, that makes the Meditations the document it is. Because what Marcus recorded was not what he knew. It was the effort of trying to live according to what he knew, failing regularly, and beginning again. That effort has no expiration date. It is recognizable in anyone who tries to be better than they are, who knows what they should do and frequently doesn't do it, who goes to sleep aware of where they fell short and wakes up intending to try again. Marcus Aurelius died facing the wall in a military camp at peace, not because he had resolved everything, because he had accepted that resolving everything was never the point. The point was to try, every night, with the notebook open. If a sentence from Marcus Aurelius stayed with you after this story, any sentence at all, go find it in the Meditations and read the entire chapter surrounding it. Context changes everything. The quotes that circulate on social media with the marble portrait in the background are real. Marcus wrote them. But they were written by a man who may have spent that day managing a plague, commanding a war, or burying a child. When you read them with that context, the meaning shifts. They don't become more pessimistic. They become heavier and more useful at the same time. They are no longer aphorisms from a sage who has achieved peace. They are notes from a man who was trying to make it through the next day with some measure of dignity. That version is harder to put on a poster, and much harder to ignore. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you're the first to know when the next videos drop. And leave a comment with the line from the meditations that hit you hardest, or with the decision Marcus made that you just can't wrap your head around. The next video is coming soon. The story